Hello everyone, welcome back to our Spring Boot series. During my latest video, which was about Spring profiles, I recall that there was a lot of explanations about configuration. And the Spring profiles, it's highly coupled with configurations and the way you provide parameters to your application. But then I started to see my previous videos and I didn't create the specific video to explain what are the different ways for you to provide configuration for your application, and most of them should be external, as I will explain in a moment. And that's why I decided to create this video, at least to show you 6 methods for where you can configure your application. It's not that you need all of them at the same time, but most of the time, at least 2 or 3 of them probably you will want to use at the same time. So you have to understand the precedence between them. You have to understand what is the most important, or what is the first one that it's applied. What if you have a second configuration with the same key? How Spring Boot, let's say, handles this ambiguity. So which one will have precedence over the other? So let's start and explain these 6 methods that I'm listing here. So first, why do we want to externalize configuration? I think nowadays, every time you develop an application, you should take into consideration the externalization of your configuration. And then I can explain to you quite easily why. Even today, I was developing a bicep script, which is a language that you can use. It's similar to Terraform. Let's say it's I didn't say it's a script language, it's more a declarative way for you to define what are the resources, the databases, container apps, Docker files, and things like that, that you want to deploy. And then using the precedence and some parameters, it will create the resource on the cloud. And as I was saying, I was creating for a database. And this database, it's a specific server, and then you create the database, you want to run some scripts. But at the end of this, I will need information that will be generated by the cloud, because part of the information I know, but other I need to wait for the resource to be created. At least, for instance, the full address of the server, sometimes in a dev environment, it can change unless you have specific DNS, something like that. But let's put that aside just for the sake of the argument. So I will need at least the final address of this database. And then I have to take this final address, and for the next resource that I want to create, which is a container app, it's a kind of a REST API that I will deploy after this one, I have to take this configuration and inject on a Docker container. And when the Docker container executes, of course, it will take this configuration. And you say, okay, it seems that I don't see the big relevance about the external here. I understand that it needs a parameter. But the question is, when I'm developing, it's not this address. I don't have to wait. I am already providing a kind of a default server to be used. But when I put in production or in the cloud, even if it's a dev environment, I want the configuration that I already have inside the application to be overridden by this one that comes from outside. And this is one of the first principles when you are externalizing application using Spring Boot. You will see that the precedence of the configuration comes from the outside of the Spring Boot to the inside. It's somehow contrary to what we expect. We expect that as close as we are from the code, the properties should override the ones that already exist, but it's not the case. For instance, if you provide something at the command line, it will you define it, like for instance the address of the database in your application or your REST API. Even if you define, let's say, in the environment variable or a configuration in the properties, this one from outside will override the one that exists in the properties, even knowing that the properties will be, let's say, taken into consideration after this definition. So that's one of the things that I want to say to you before I explain which one of the scenarios. So probably we have to invert the way you are used to think about this kind of configurations, because when you think about object-oriented, you have something that is abstract and then you refine it, you override things. But in Spring Boot, the configuration, it's the other way around. As even if you refine from the abstract part, from the outside part of your application. So let's see now for each one, so you will understand. So the precedence, as I was saying, it's like this one. So if you provide the configuration at the command line, as a command line argument, it will override any other one that you put on your application. even if it's Java system properties using the Java virtual machine parameters, or even environment variables, or application properties, which is really close to your application. Even if you define there a property, but in the command line you provide the same property, the property from the command line will override the one that is inside because it is already defined. It's not that you redefine the property, it's if it already exists, Spring Boot will not overwrite it. Maybe it's the best way for you to think about the configurations. Then, of course, you have application properties inside the jar. If you are using property source annotation, this is a kind of annotation that you can put on a bin, and you can, let's say, map a properties file. It's not a configuration per se, but it's a way for you to put configuration in your code in a most easier way to work on. And then, of course, there are the default properties that exist on the Spring Boot. So let's see the 6 methods that I talk about on the first slide. So this is the most common and foundational method, which is to use the application properties. I'm not the method one. It's not the precedence over the others. It's not about precedence. I'm just show you the 6 ways for you to provide configurations. If you want to understand the precedence, it is these ones. So now I'm talking about this fourth, which is application properties, and I will say when should we use which one of these methods. But the precedence, it's on this slide, the precedence order. Remember, it's from the outside: command, Java, operating system, then the property inside the application, and then default properties inside your application. So if you want a trick to remember easily which property will be applied, it's the most, let's say, far away from your application execution. So command line, it's the completely outside of your application. If the property exists there, it will be the one applied to your Spring Boot, even if you have one with the same name inside. So method one, it's about application properties. It's a place where you can define properties. So by default, you usually create an application properties, and everything that you put there will be loaded automatically by the Spring Boot. You have an alternative way. People sometimes like more the YAML because it's like a tree, so it's easier for the human eye. So usually it's located on source main resources. Probably it's the first lesson when you start with Spring Boot, is to understand the application properties. But as I was saying, YAML is often preferred for its readability and the hierarchical structure. So what is the use case? When should you use it? Probably all the time, because some default you want a place where you have all the default properties for your application. Then you can override going outside on the command line, environment variables, and things like that. So providing sensible defaults for your application that are shared across all environments. It's the application properties. This is an example using YAML. In YAML, you can see a tree. If you are using not YAML but properties, you will see server.port and the equal sign to this value. You just flat the tree and you have the properties. If you unflat and create a tree, you have the YAML. Sometimes people like this because it groups information about server, information about Spring, information about database. I think it's easier to read. Another one is profile specific properties. And if you want to know a lot more about this, you can see my previous video about Spring profiles, where I explain in detail how it works. But you can, let's say, segregate configurations and bins for specific, I wouldn't say environments, but whatever you want. You can create specific configurations for database, message queues, or dev environment, or quality environment, and production. You define a name and you can set properties and bins inside that name. That's so you want to use these when, for instance, imagine that in development you use an H2 database or a MySQL, but in production you are using something like Oracle, something like that. So you need different configuration files. So in these cases, and again, you can see my previous video, you add another file, you have application properties, for instance, so you have application, and then you add here a name. It's the name that you want. Then you can activate or not based in a different ways. You can see on my previous video how you can activate it. But then the Spring Boot will load first the application properties or application YAML file, and then will load the other ones, and you can load more than one profile, and it will override or not the properties. Meaning that imagine that you have an application property, something like I'm using MySQL as a database. Now when you go to staging, you create a file called application staging. So it starts with the database as MySQL, but if you're staged now and you activate the profile, you use a different database, let's say Postgres, the Postgres will override that, but only for profiles, not for configurations. For configurations, it's the other way around. So let's see a code example. For instance, you can see you have let's say an application properties or application YAML, but if you add another file called application prod, when you activate the prod profile and you define this DB, if this DB exists on your application, the default one, these properties will override the other ones. Meaning in production, you're using Postgres, and for instance, in dev or the default, it's H2 or MySQL or something like that. Method 3, which is command line arguments. So the command line arguments usually overrides everything. Okay, but how can you provide configuration using the command line? The command line usually use like spring.key. It's like the same as you use on the properties file. Okay, you can use Spring or your own properties, but you have to use these two symbols to separate the arguments like this. So if you use something like this, server port something or DB username test user. Now, if you already developed in Spring Boot, you already know that most of the times the server port, it's in the application properties and it's close to the application. But if you start the application and on the command line you provide this one, this value will override any one that exists in the properties file. People expect, again, for the properties file, since it's closest to the code, to be overriding the outside one. But again, on configurations, it is the outsiders that will override the internals. So what we are saying here, run this application with all the configuration that exists, but for these properties, if they exist, override them. If they don't exist, just add them. So you can add properties or override properties that already exist. So you can see that it's quickly overriding a single property for a temporary test or specific run. Usually if you have something on the properties, you expect to be that properties to be used. That's why you have, for instance, Spring profiles. But sometimes you want to do a test, as I'm saying here, or other scenarios, or you want to test something or change the port because there is a conflict, and you can just override anything that exists on your application by using the command line. Another method is using environment variables. Probably it's the most popular one when you deploy in the clouds. I'm using all the time in Docker. When I'm starting a container, usually you have these environment variables. They can be overridden by the command line, but usually they are high on the hierarchy, so they can override a lot of everything that exists, for instance, in the properties. But there are some tricks, some surprises that sometimes people don't know in Spring Boot. Usually when you define an environment variable, it's a common practice to put everything capitalized and use the underscore to split to make it more readable. My property. But sometimes people don't know if you use this in a environment variable, and if there is internally a property called my lowercase dot property, it will be overridden. And if it's not, it doesn't exist, it will be created by the Spring Boot. So Spring Boot takes the environment variables inside and use it as properties also. Be careful when you run your Spring Boot application. If you want something more deep, you can add other underscores. You can even create levels like this, my app db address, just using environment variables. Nice, right? Use case, containerized deployments in Docker, Kubernetes. It's quite popular because most of the time you'll be using environment variables, not using files or properties. Most of the times using environment variables. In my case, for instance, I will get an address from the database and I will create an environment variable, export it, and when I start the container, he knows now where is the database, where it should connect. And maybe it can put internally in a variable or in a property that it can use to access the database. So I developed a container, a REST API that does know nothing about the database. Of course, it should know at least the driver, but apart from that, it doesn't know where it is, but it will be provided to him using an environment variable. So how can we do this? Imagine that if you are in a Docker file, or even if you use an export in an operating system, same thing, environment, DB username. Internally, you can inject using spell something that I will create soon, a video about it, the Spring Boot, which is you use this annotation, and this will get the property that exists on the Spring and will inject here on this property on your bin. And you can do the same for username and password. In my case, I will do for the connection string, and it should work out of the box. At least I expect tomorrow for this to work, and it should. I already did in the past. So the method finds Spring Cloud Configuration Server, that this will be the subject I will address in details in my future videos. I already, sometimes I teach about this, to use the Spring Cloud, and Spring Cloud contains one of the things is a configuration server, which is a central place where multiple services can get configurations that exist, for instance, on Git. You are not required to put on Git. You can put it on a local file system, for instance, but you can put on Git. One advantage of the Git is that you have versioning and things like that. So imagine that you have three different containers, or three different microservices, or three different applications, or even one application, and you just using a REST API, you can connect to a Spring Cloud Configuration Services. Give me this property. So this configuration is centralized in a place that can be versioned, can be controlled, and can be managed by admins or DevOps teams and things like that. So you don't have to provide a local properties file or configurations on the environment. Everything is in a central place. Of course, there is some cost of that. If the central place fails, any application can receive any configuration, but you can create, usually as I do, I create just default properties that should be enough for the application to start, at least to throw errors, say I cannot get more information. And then I have the Spring Cloud configuration server outside. So I didn't want to put all this configuration, but at the end of the day, you just have a configuration repository. I will create a video about this in the future, but you create a repo on Git, okay, and where you put files like this: application, user service, order service, and then these names will map services with this get. You can see this get order service for the environment prod, and then this will be the profile. Again, related with profiles that I created in a previous video. Then if you have another application, you do get user service on your configuration server, and you say, I want a profile prod for this. If you don't put prod here, you will receive the default. It's like as you are doing, when you call the configuration server, you are doing what Spring Boot does automatically when you start your application locally. But since now you can have multiple applications and you need a central server, you have to teach him about what you want. In this case, you say, okay, I want a configuration about user service, okay, for this profile. And then you can get the properties, set the properties and things like that. That's another way for you to externalize configuration. When you have microservice, multiple applications, and you want to centralize the configuration in one place, you can use the Spring Cloud configuration servers. It's quite easy to work there with just a few videos. I think you start to understand and apply on your infrastructure and your solution. Another solution, it's not, in the past was really popular. I remember when I was teaching about enterprise Java beans and things like that, it was really used, which is Java native, I don't remember the directory interface. It works a kind of a DNS, but for resources. It's not to find machines, it's to find beans, to find data source. It's quite popular if you use Tomcat, and probably use it with Spring Boot, but sometimes you are not using it today. But in the past, there was some XML files where you define connection pools, beans that exist. All of them, they have a kind of an address, to connection strings, where is this database, and a lot of configuration. It's a kind of an internal tree, like a DNS on the internet, but to target objects. So it was quite popular, and most of the times when we today with Spring Boot, you just say, okay, I need a bin with this name. But in the past, you have to provide an address, something like this. You have to provide things like this. Java comp environment is like a tree, and then after this you put the name of the enterprise Java bean or the other beans, something like that. It's a way to find things and organize things in a tree. And it can be used also for configuration. It's mostly used in legacy applications, because nowadays Spring Boot doesn't need this directly unless you deploy your Spring Boot in a let's say a web server that it's not Tomcat, where you have multiple applications, and it's still used in banks and things like that due to the support, and in the past they were using that, so they are not changing, but it's legacy. But it's still used. Don't take it. Say, okay, I don't have to know about it because it's not used. Yeah, it is a lot. It's used everywhere, but usually the new projects don't use it as much as in the past. Okay. Let's see a code example. You can see you define a resource, and you can see probably if you take a Java Enterprise course, you will see something like this. You can see the under JDBC you have this data source container. It's where it will run. The type, the driver that is supporting this. This is of course the address for the connection string, username, password, but it will be something like this. And you can apply this to not only to data source, but even to specific. In Spring Boot, we call it beans. In Java Enterprise, it's called also somehow beans, but it's an enterprise Java beans, and there were different types of beans and things like that with scope. There is a big intersection between the Spring Boot beans and these beans from Java Enterprise. The concepts are almost the same. Even some annotations like inject and things like that are the same, but Spring Boot it's a little bit different in some points, and it's faster and requires less configuration to work. I would say something like that. That's why it's more popular. So in summary, these are the different methods to have external configurations in Spring Boot. Of course, you have the application. It's the default. The precedence, it's really low. Then you have the profile. See my previous video about profiles if you want to understand more. Environment specific settings, it's medium. Command line, it's high. It's the highest one. So everything that you put on the command line will override anything here apart from the cloud config, because if you think for a while, the cloud config, it's even far away from the command line. So if you think about distance, if you can think like that, you have an application at the center, the service that is really far away, it's the cloud because it's another server. Then you have the command line, that's why you have high, and you have environment variables they are somehow at the same level of the command line, but command line precedes the environment variables. And then you have the profile specific or Java native database direct interface, because this resides not on the application but on the web server that supports the application. And then this is the closest one to the application, which has the interface, meaning that any configuration here will override any one of the others. Then on the second level, you have command line environment variables, then the medium, and then the low. And these are usually the common 6 ways for you to externalize the configuration of your application. So use the right tool for the job. Of course, which one should you choose? Depends. Maybe you have a set of them. Sometimes, of course, application probably you will use for sure. Command line, when you need to override, you can see all the scenarios that we explored a few minutes ago, and you can return always to this video to take decisions, but don't say, I will use cloud config. Yeah, probably will use cloud config, but maybe you still need application, and once in a while, maybe you need some command line for configurations that, for instance, don't exist in cloud config. You have to think, and that's why use the right tool for the job. Leverage precedence to your advantage. Check what is the most important and less important, what are the defaults that usually are not overridden. In those cases, probably put on property files, things that you should know that will be overridden a lot. And if you don't need it to be the default, just don't add them. Required to be environment variables or command line. For instance, I remember that sometimes I have kind of tokens to authorization tokens on my applications. Sometimes I put default ones, but sometimes I say I will not. I will require a token to be explicitly sent by the environment variable. So I am sure that someone has to generate it, put it on a vault, and provide it to my application. And then people can authenticate or can get access to the resource using this token. So I require that this attribute exists at a command level or environment level, doesn't exist on the properties file, because I don't want there, because it can create a kind of a hole on the security. That's what I'm talking about, the leverage precedence to your advantage. Think careful about which property should be in each place, and never commit secrets to your Git repository. That's what I was saying. Don't put on properties files and things like that the token, because if someone can look into it, maybe you say, okay, but it's internal to the company. But sometimes people just leave the company, and sometimes they leave it in a very, let's say, not nice way, and you don't know what can do with information. So avoid at all costs, even with your colleagues, to share secret information. If it's not there, it cannot be remembered. So using environment variables or a config server for sensitive data, because it's outside of your application. So thank you for watching this video. I hope it was useful for you. And I hope that you now have let's say, a broad vision about the possibilities of the configuration. And remember, we have two things here. One, it's the different ways for you to apply configuration and how they work together. What is the precedence between them? You always have these two dimensions that you should take into account when you design your application. Again, thank you for watching. Share my channel, subscribe, put a like, add some comments. Let's say you can ask me to talk about subject. Usually I try to define what will be my next videos based on the previous ones, maybe experience. Maybe sometimes people ask me things and I say, okay, maybe I'll create a video about this, but be free to comment and share with your friends. It will give me motivation to create more videos. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you in my next video.